And part of this idea of using beauty towards freedom is that, one of the things that I've realized is that I've been my most disempowered when I've been in my most negative, cynical space, because it limits your imagination, it limits your flexibility in thinking. And you need an imagination in order to think up solutions to a problem, and you need optimism, especially, to be your most creative.
What does it mean to be truly human? And Schiller is exactly addressing this. He would be furious about the conclusion of the Frankfurt School, because he said, no, quite on the contrary, what happened was a result of the lack of beauty as a corrective during the preceding ages and the preceding decades before the Second World War.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest Fireside Chat. I'm your host, David Goslin, and I'm here with two new and very distinguished guests. We have here Cynthia Chung, who is the director of the Rising Tide Foundation, a journalist, and writes on all sorts of topics, which we'll be able to jump into. And then we have Dr. Uwe Alschner, who is also a journalist, a consultant, has a background in policy, and even farm, I think. And so we have two interesting guests here that we've brought to discuss, of all things, a poet, right? You guys are in policy making, geopolitical analysis, historical analysis. And yet I thought it would be good to have you guys here because you've all written on the importance of the works of the poet Friedrich Schiller and the role of classical education in sort of grounding people in these contentious political and social times. So guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having.
And so Uwe, you over in Germany. Whereabouts in Germany again?
If you draw a line from Amsterdam to Berlin, west-east connection, Amsterdam, Berlin, and the north-south connection, Hamburg to Cologne. I'm right where the two lines will cross. So it's in the northwest of Germany. It's comparatively close to the North Sea, but it's still an hour and a half to drive to get to the shore. But it's 10 hours drive to go to Italy. So roughly that's where we are.
Interesting. Well, shout out to Deutschland. And we have Cynthia here, who's by the lovely Lachine Canal in Montreal. Spring has finally sprung. So yeah, I think it's a great discussion. And you guys recently wrote some articles on the question of Schiller and classical education. Most recently, Uwe, you had a very fine piece simply titled The Future of Humanity. And you've been discussing various policy questions. You worked on a documentary with Vera Sharav called Never Again Is Now. Sharav is a Holocaust survivor, and you guys have put out some very compelling work right now. So in your article, Uwe, I'll just read something because we're going to be reading Schiller quotes throughout this discussion for people and getting them acquainted with Schiller and why he might be useful for anyone who has some hopes of seeing a genuine and lasting cultural and aesthetic revival. There's a lot of stuff to read out there, and Schiller isn't that well known. So having two of my fellow Schiller buddies, I think will help to, give people a sense of why that is. So in The Future of Humanity, Uwe, you write, it was the German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller who, after studying the disaster of the French Revolution, had come to the conclusion that only the combined development of both essential human capacities, for feeling as well as for thought, could bring about the most perfect of all works of art with the construction of true political freedom. Anytime we're talking about the role of poetry or art in politics, people can get apprehensive or wary. But you've written on this a fair bit, Uwe, and the role that just listening to a classical composition has played in helping you to regain composure in our contentious times. So yeah, what would you say to people who today there's often this idea that, well, who's to say classical music is any different than any other kind of music, right? Mozart helped you regain composure, but why can't I just sit on the porch, turn on some Stevie Nicks, have a glass of sangria and a cigarette, and why is that any less transcendent, right? So people are going to say, okay, maybe there's better or worse art, but can you really say that there's something is objectively more beautiful or less beautiful than something else? Like, who's to say classical art is superior or better? And people get worked up. They're like, what are you, a fascist or something, right? Back in the day, the Congress for Cultural Freedom played a big role on that, which maybe we can discuss later, in terms of trying to disabuse people from the idea that there could be some objective notion of aesthetics or beauty. And yet Schiller makes the case, right?
Yes, yes, he does. So thanks, David, for inviting me to this wonderful talk, which gives me the opportunity to be in a meeting, in a recording with Cynthia Chung, for the first time, which also connects to my getting to learn about Friedrich Schiller, because that is due to having watched a talk which Cynthia has given a couple of years back. I think it's 2 or 3 years, about transhumanism, which related to my work, which you mentioned, with Vera Sharaf. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but it is. I have very great sympathy for people who don't know Schiller, because I didn't know Schiller very much, and I knew him by name. Being German, you have to know Schiller because in every town there is a street named after him. But last time I read something from Schiller was in school, and it was The Robbers, and it was, it was, well, it was an old story. It didn't really have much consequence for my studies. So I thought, because the way I was introduced to it was quite, boring or traditional or whatever you want to call it. And in this talk about transhumanism, and why this will not succeed, which is the most important part of it, Cynthia ended on a Schiller quote. It is through beauty that we will get to freedom. Or I don't have the literal quote with me in English now, but that's basically the essence. And I really was, this emotional inner voice saying, yes, I want to believe this, because everything looks so dire and looks so bleak out there. And this is something which I want to hold tight and hold dear to my heart. But at the same time, I thought, but then again, I must admit it's a bit naive, isn't it? I mean, how would this work? How would this work? And then I remember that I made a decision. I made a conscious decision to take up this guy Schiller and look, first of all, where he wrote it. It's in a very, quite little elaborate piece on the aesthetical education of man, which I really recommend people read, but not to expect to make any sense of it too soon, because it's at least for me it was quite a challenge. But since I made the decision to really understand this, I eventually I got a good understanding of what Schiller meant by this, and this is then the connection where I could embrace what my children. So I've got 3 children with me and my wife, and they've always been saying my work in the political arena, my work as a journalist, trying to expose and and investigate scandals. Of course, the most glaring of which being that what we call COVID, or this was something which was very depressing. It was, in fact, the way how I got introduced to Vera Sharaf via this work. Again, this is just to say that my children said, why are you doing this? You don't do it for us. This is something which is a burden on you. It wears you out. Don't dig into this negative stuff for us. We don't want you to do that. And here with Schiller, I had something which was beautiful, and it was even emphasizing the importance of beauty and classical art to get to freedom, which of course is what we all wanted, wasn't it? I mean, we wanted to have our sovereignty, we wanted to have our freedom, but what is exactly freedom? I mean, it's a very well used word, but like with beauty, many people have many definitions of what freedom means. So this was the starting point, and it was, as I said, 2.5, 3 years ago. So I'm newcomer to this party. I cannot say that I was very educated in terms of classical art or even Schiller. But since then, this conscious decision has taken me very far into this. It's been a wonderful journey so far, and I expect it to be a wonderful going forward, because it's really it carries truth, it carries beauty, and that's what one can discover. One last word before I hand over to you, David and Cynthia. Classical art, yeah, I also understand why people would have reservations about it. It doesn't really play much role, does it? On the other hand, listening to talks from the Rising Tide Foundation, which I'm really indebted to, educating me a fair bit, I've come to understand that classical doesn't mean old, doesn't mean irrelevant. It just means timeless. It is something which is of timeless essence, which is something which you can understand from reason, and this is something which eventually will define its classic quality, because there's something in it which will last through all the modes and fashions which one has come to experience from art and all this business during my lifetime, at least.
Right. And yeah, I think that, I mean, Cynthia, you write on the same thing in terms of the artist's role in creating things that do outlast the modes and fashions of an age. And is that possible? Or is everybody just the product of their age? You write, let's see here. Yeah. Due to all these complications and complexities, it is believed by many that this is actually an impossible task, transcending our age, or not just being a product of our age, that no one can escape being ultimately a product of their time, and thus are subjugated to the prejudices and fallacies of such a time. They conclude that the great writers of the past will always be limited in their use and influence on the present and the future. That's always a big thing, right? And again, you're coming from a policy standpoint as well. Maybe you can say something about how you're thinking about the role of art for something like the Rising Tide Foundation, what the Rising Tide Foundation looks to. But yeah, what do we say to people who ultimately feel like you have to work within your times, but stop there, right? Even if that's true, they don't go further, and to this higher timeless dimension.
Mm-hmm. Um, I apologize if at some point it's going to get loud because every now and then there's loud trucks going by, which I should have maybe chose a different location. But thank you as well for having me on, and Uwe, that was a great introduction to the conversation, and always nice to hear your story and where you're coming from, and how quickly you're just absorbing all of this material. But it's very very similar for like the English culture too, for Shakespeare. Like Shakespeare is considered, I would say, standard teaching for all English courses, and yet very many people, even though Shakespeare is, I would say, more well known in terms of like multiple plays he's written, people don't really still understand Shakespeare on a higher level either, or even like how political his plays were in the art that he was doing. And on that note too, even like classical music, Beethoven, Mozart were incredibly political people, and you can say there is politics in art. And part of this idea of using beauty towards freedom is that, one of the things that I've realized is that I've been my most disempowered when I've been in my most negative, cynical space, because it limits your imagination, it limits your flexibility in thinking. And you need an imagination in order to think up solutions to a problem, and you need optimism, especially, to be your most creative in a solution orientation. And also, when you have access to beauty, you are actually also accessing something beautiful inside yourself. So when we have a culture that denies beauty increasingly, like the Frankfurt School, especially played a very large role in this, that ugliness was the real reality, the raw reality after, the atrocities of World War II, and we had to confront this ugliness within ourselves. But we also have something beautiful, and obviously, in order to uplift yourself out of the ugliness, you need the beauty somewhere to move to. And I find it very sad that so many people can see only a reality of ugliness. You're actually denying a huge part of yourself, and you're denying a huge part of a conversation you can have with yourself. And that's like another role that art has to play, is that, we have to be able to have conversations with ourselves. A lot of people, they can't even like spend too much time alone. Like it's weird. Like we have a culture that's very isolationist, but people are still like they're always on their like phone, like social media, or they're constantly like their attention is still being grabbed by something. But to like be alone with your thoughts, like walk through a park, do something that requires a conversation with yourself, because we should all be having thoughts inside of our head, which is a form of conversation. These are all like incredibly important things to have. And that was like one of the things about the Frankfurt School that you can see has really gone into music and entertainment, is a direction towards schizophrenia. And like the Frankfurt School even, said it very outright that that was like a goal of theirs. And the CIA, the Tavistock Institute, Congress for Cultural Freedom, Esalen Institute, which Dave has done a lot of work on the subject. So your audience should have I would say, a certain familiarity with those things. It was all to push people towards dissociative patterns in thinking. We actually want to, and we're most happy and healthy and balanced when we are able to have a conversation with ourselves. It's not just like meditation where you empty the mind, sort of idea. So art from that sense is very political because its first goal is to empower the individual. And once the individual is an empowered person, then they can empower others. And so that's how I view timeless art, which Uwe, that was great of you to clarify that classical really means timeless. And we're human beings, no matter what age we're born into, we all go through similar struggles, of what you have to overcome spiritually, which is never a journey that really changes all that much. Like there might be different forms of distraction, but even then it is like the same old story. You look at the philosophical dialogues from ancient Greece, and it's the same debates of what is beauty, what is the point of life? Is it to seek out pleasure, avoid pain? Where we have like the same issues. And if you're too bounded to with like the world you live in, that also isolates yourself from other cultures in the world as well, right? We have a universality of what is to be human, and just because you're in a different culture doesn't mean you can't have a communion with another human being, even in a different culture. And so that's what Rising Tide tries to do in a nutshell, is to approach these subjects from that standpoint of to empower the individual. And again, very much a Platonic method in the search for truth, but Schiller was very special in the sense that he was the one to really emphasize beauty like no other philosopher that I had heard outside of his work, and that to be a good person, you don't have to be stoic. And that's what so many people think, you have to be Kantian. And he was like, you can be free and you can will it. It will come to you naturally. And that's when we're, in the best place that we are, is that we naturally will desire what is the best, and it doesn't have to feel like a duty.
Right. Yeah, and again, Schiller has so many great quotes on this. So I think we want to give people a sense of that. I'll just read something from Schiller, which you quoted, Uwe. As the mind in the intuition of the beautiful finds itself in a happy medium between law, the rational solution, and necessity, the action taken in survival mode, it is because it divides itself between both, emancipated from the pressure of both. So beauty stands in this intuitive or transcendent middle where necessity and reason naturally unite, right? And it's there to show us that that does happen, whether we choose to embody that or pursue it. Schiller makes the point remains our choice, right? Everybody has free will, but he's saying that the aesthetic consciousness creates this intuitive state where you actually have an example of the things, reason, these dualities being resolved through beauty. And that's an essential reminder. That's essential to the development of the character, right? And as Schiller says, I know of only one secret to guarding man against depravity, and that is to arm his heart against weakness, right? And how does he do that if he doesn't have any beautiful conceptions or notions? Or inversely, I mean, if ugliness is the main thing that we have to address because there is this ugliness, and the reason that we had things like the Holocaust or all sorts of, the French Revolution is because people were starry-eyed romantics who didn't want to look at the evil, face the evil and ugliness in man. And therefore, it's art's job to present that ugliness, to present that evil, supposedly in order to allow people to resolve it. But I think, as you said, Cynthia, if there isn't a higher conception of beauty, then just surrounding people with ugliness, they disassociate, right? People check out. We see that all the time. And that's normal, right? It's not because there's something wrong with them. It's because there's something missing in our culture, right? There's something that's not being fed and cultivated in people. And so, Cynthia, your essay, which we'll link to in the description, that everybody should get a chance to read, including the Schiller's Theater as a Moral Institution, and they should read Schiller's actual essay. But just a quote from that essay, which you cite: "The stage brings before us a rich array of human woes. It artfully involves us in the troubles of others and rewards us for this momentary pain with tears of delight and a splendid increase in our courage and experience. What our soul only senses as distant premonition, we hear audibly and incontrovertibly affirmed by the startled voice of nature. Eternity leaves its dead behind so that they may reveal secrets which the living could never divine. And the cocksure villain is driven from his final ghastly lair, for even graves blurt out their secrets. But not satisfied with merely acquainting us with the fates of mankind, the stage also teaches us to be more just toward the victim of misfortune, and to judge him more leniently, for only once we can plumb the depths of his tormented soul are we entitled to pass judgment on him. Only here, on the stage, do the world's mighty men hear what they never or rarely hear elsewhere: truth. And here they see what they never or rarely see: man. Theater considered as a moral institution." I think that's a beautiful quote that could be unpacked for a while. But yeah, I mean, Cynthia, you were citing this in an essay about transhumanism, right? That was your
that one was like just a short write-up, I think, on like what is the role of the artist and like the French Revolution. And I bring up Schiller like super quickly on the Harari presentation on transhumanism that Uwe was talking about. But it's like it's at the very, very end. I don't really go too much into Schiller, but I'm so happy that it was so effective like on Uwe. That makes me feel like really great because what do you say at the end of a presentation on transhumanism? It's something that you have to find within yourself, which it's difficult for people to know what the alternative to the world of like that kind of direction of is constantly trying to dehumanize us. What is a humanized person if you don't have like, even an example that is meaningful that you can relate to. So Schiller, I only mentioned him briefly, and again, really happy that Uwe sought Schiller out because of that. But yeah, did you want to flesh out that beautiful quote though from
well,
theater as a moral institution?
yeah, and I mean, I think in and just in contrast to, yeah, what is the view that Schiller's offering here? In contrast to say something like transhumanism, which for people who aren't familiar, just in short, yeah, maybe if you want to contrast them.
I've noticed that there are still a few shows that are using that kind of classical structure, which are actually Chinese TV shows that are like very impressive with the level of human psychology that they have, but they don't like here in the West we tend to look at like the worst qualities, or we really I think oversimplify the psychology of characters, and it's become very formulaic, and it doesn't really go deeper into the psychology unless it's like a dark negative one. And what I really liked about that quote from Schiller, which is what all the best dramas do. So Schiller wrote these wonderful dramas that were also based on historical situations. Uwe is going to give a class, I think, soon to the Rising Tide on his Queen Elizabeth, I think, piece, right, with Mary of Scots.
Mary's
Are you going to be doing a presentation on that soon, or?
I'm going to be talking about the importance of the 1776 humanist idea of happiness and for the situation. I think that there is someone who I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to name it, but Matthew has said that someone else will be just giving a talk a week before me, and maybe that's what you were referring to. I haven't been working too much about Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots so far, but it's also a very fascinating period in history.
Okay, my bad. But Uwe did do a really nice class on Leibniz not that long ago to Rising Tide as well. But yeah, he's done really good dramas. Verdi has done operas off of his dramas,
Right.
and what you really see is like Schiller is showing it's not like an oversimplification, but at the same time, like it's like if we were to not only speak our thoughts out loud that we would normally have as thoughts inside in a good drama, but that we would also be kind of like more in tune and aware of the thoughts that were going on inside your head that are now being spoken out loud. So, you'll have like in this case, this is a Shakespeare example, but an Iago type character, right, who's speaking these really ugly monologues out loud. And some of these characters will even sometimes think about like my soul might be damned, but what of it sort of thing, because there's this kind of dilemma. If these kinds of characters were able to have like more of a communication even within their own minds and have more of a self-awareness. Sometimes characters do, but what that does is it teaches the audience about thoughts that are going on inside their own heads, like what is shaping certain currents, like what makes a person go towards villainous acts, what makes a person who has like the makings of a hero or something of like a very big status, what makes them fail ultimately through certain forms of corruption or just like being played by others. So these are all like really useful lessons, even for the average person, but especially if you want to be going into a sort of political arena, which again is not just for like politicians. People I think really have a narrow idea of what politics is today, that it's only politicians who really need to know about politics. And I mean, honestly, if we view ourselves as living in a democracy, which most Western, people, they view themselves as proud to live in a democracy, which means you have responsibility as a citizen, right? To have a certain kind of awareness of things. And so the role of education is so that we are not just like totally clueless of what's going on. I think that's another bad habit that we formed, is that, I have to have a degree in something in order to have an informed or educated opinion of it. And that's not true. We can teach ourselves by reading up on subjects. It's not like you have to be given a grade before you can think or speak about a certain subject. So yeah, like Schiller is showing in some ways access to the mind of villainy, which he again starts off with Ghost Seer too, saying that's like one of the worst things, is that the average person tends to not understand what makes someone a villain, so to speak. And if you don't understand that, you also can't protect yourself against certain forms of corruption as well. As you can see in our culture, there is a kind of lack of morality. There's a lack of caring for the future, which means we're not caring as much as it used to be, stressed a lot more to leave a better world for those who would follow after us. And I think people have become so disempowered that they don't even think that that's like a possibility anymore, or to fight for a better world. But it's also to showcase a really heartbreaking vulnerability and fallibility to man, which is where we see man, from that standpoint too, so that you, even from a villain, you can see something human as a struggle, which is a failing struggle if that person ultimately becomes a villain. But it's still, we are saddened by the fact that they failed something that would have allowed them better access to something human inside of them. And that's also why we're moved by tragedy. And Schiller has done some really beautiful essays too on like why do we gravitate and why are we moved by tragedy, and heroes who will even make sacrifices. Why do we get very emotionally moved by such acts? Because nobody wants, to sacrifice themselves. And I mean, I don't mean it in a utilitarian way or anything. Obviously, if you fight for something, you're taking risks, and there's something noble about, being willing to take risks.
Yeah, and here on the Sublime, there's a few things that I would like to say here. But yeah, I like the point you made where people, okay, if we're in a democratic society, that means people have a responsibility because they need to know how things work. They need to know how their society works. So it's actually the threshold for what you actually is required from a citizen is much higher. And yet, then the first instinct though is like, oh, okay, so I don't know enough about how society works. I should probably get a degree in political science or sociology or something. And yet, like the point you're making, I think, is that actually, well, no, in fact, that could cripple you, but also a much easier path. I wouldn't say a shortcut. I don't necessarily believe in shortcuts, but there are paths of least resistance. Reading classical tragedy, right? Classical tragedy is where you see axioms played out, right? You see potential, whether realized or lost, right? Tragedy gives us that degree of freedom to see the whole spectrum of personalities and characters. And so it's not prescriptive, right? Classical art isn't there to say, don't do this, don't do that, or do this, or be a good person. But it's putting the whole thing before you and letting it play out. And I think in terms of psychology, the reason that can have such a profound effect on people is that oftentimes it's people's refusal to play out a vision of themselves or an idea of themselves that they don't like, right? Or things they're like, yeah, in their mind, they're a much better person than they are, maybe. And so then they're surprised when they make certain mistakes, right? And they're disappointed with themselves. Tragedy is preemptive in that sense, in that it plays the whole thing out for you, and that can shock people, right? Because they weren't necessarily psychologically ready to play out the whole thing, right? And they find that they see themselves in the characters on that stage. And so, yeah, it is very complex and dynamic in that sense. And so the irony for me is that with all this talk of, the Frankfurt School, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and all these ideas in a lot of modern art, early 20th century modern art, that man has to face the ugliness within him. And yeah, that beauty sort of the romanticized idea of beauty has just crippled man's ability to face reality. And yet there's been a dearth of tragic compositions in the 20th century, right? We're also told that tragedy, the argument was made that tragedy is also outdated, right? Because people don't have all the same shared values anymore. And so for tragedy as an institution to work as it did in ancient Greece, it's because people had these collective meaning maps so they could all relate and emote with the thing. But in a secular world, you can't really have tragedy as art anymore because people have different ideas, right? And so I feel these kind of things, right, there's a rejection of universals, right, in the assumption for that argument. But yeah, the irony is there's been a dearth of tragedy in an age where we were told that man had to face the ugliness. And so, yeah, and ironically, tragedy I mean, I've just been reading the Phaedra plays. I read a version by Racine. I read a version by Seneca. There are other versions as well, and it's a tragedy. You know, Phaedra, stepmom of Hippolytus, Theseus's son, is in love with her stepson, and in different versions, you know, is she gonna act on it, or you know, once it's known, how does she try to cover it up? Is she fully in control? Is she ashamed, or is she a full hog villain that does everything to hide her, you know, unapologetic acts? They're serious and ugly and you know, intense scenarios. And yet what comes across, right, the takeaway that people get is not, oh, you know, maybe my stepmom, you know, isn't that bad looking after all, or something. You know, that's not what they get. If it's done right. So yeah, tragedy has this ironic power, and I just find it funny that there's a lack of tragedy in a world where people are constantly confronted with the evils and ugliness of man.
So let me just point out to you that one reason why I really was so excited about reading Schiller, what he had to say, was because apart from being a political animal, having worked inside politics, I've also started working as a coach in 2010 around, I think it was, because of the destructive nature of politics, and I wanted to do something constructive, and so values and purpose was the thing I'd worked about, and I did some not some work, I did a lot of work in this field, and my coaching handle, so to speak, has been, let me just show you here briefly. You see here, it's the German version, ganz Menschsein, but in English, it would be translated as being wholly, truly human, or yeah, something of this kind. What does it mean to be truly human? And Schiller is exactly addressing this. He would be furious about the conclusion of the Frankfurt School and its ugly dogma, dogma of ugliness, because he said no. Quite on the contrary, it was what happened was a result of the lack of beauty as a corrective during the preceding ages and the preceding decades before the Second World War in particular. And that's because humans, if they are deprived of beauty, they will tend to become either barbarian, so that is cold-blooded, rational fascists, or they would become wild savages, being just driven by pure sentiment, hysteria, and stuff. And beauty is the quality which is able in a unique way to act on both of these essential human features. So our sensuousness and our rationality are gifts which we have been given, but we have to develop our humanity, which everyone will understand when they look at a baby. A baby is not able to live on its own. It has to be taken care of. It has to be cared for. And a baby is beautiful. Every baby is beautiful. Why is this? So Schiller is talking about beauty as something which has to be understood from a reason, a perspective of reason. And when you look at a baby, it is only reason which will lead you to the conclusion that a baby is beautiful and why it is beautiful. It can be, wrinkles and all of this, but it's still beautiful. Why? It is the next phase of life, as seen from a perspective of an adult, right? It is eternity, at least figuratively speaking, because by all means, an adult is going to die before the baby. Therefore, this is the next dimension of what life is, and therefore this is a symbol of life, and it's a symbol of beauty as well. We want to cuddle it, we want to protect it, nurture it, and stuff. And this is just one example which I have just, you know, taken randomly from the top of my head to illustrate this, what Schiller is trying to do, to say we humans, we have a need, an urgent need for beauty as something which is going to ennoble our soul, our character, and will bring about a condition in which we can fulfill our divine potential, which he's also talking about. So people have been discussing about Schiller being an atheist. No, he's not an atheist. He is very critical of church hierarchy, yes, as he is critical of other forms of despotism and hierarchy. But he's not at all atheist. In fact, I would say he's very, very what's the word, spiritual, or he's very, he believes in God. He doesn't believe in a particular formulation, which is also something classical, because that which Christians or Jews see, I mean, Christian and Jews, there's a difference, obviously, in the way they look at Christ, but at least they have the same, God as creator. But then look at China, where there is a different way of looking at things. And I'm talking, I'm way out of my depth here, and so I don't want to risk being an embarrassment to this discussion. But this is something which Schiller has in his work all along, to say there is an essential divinity within each human being, a potential, and we are called to develop this, fulfill it, and we can only do so by art, by classical art, by beauty. And that's something which I found so attractive and so inspiring and so easy to understand. Look, I understand when people say it's too much for me. I cannot understand it. It wears me out. I have to leave it. Okay, leave it. There's so much by Schiller which you can taste, basically, and it's short verse, beautiful poetry, but even his political writings. I mean, what he wrote about the Jesuits in Paraguay is something which is not beautiful in this sense, but it is extremely truthful and enlightening for our perception of fundamentalism and terrorism today. I mean, this is something which has been employed, and Schiller is uncovering this, putting it into a context of how do we prevent this? And the way we prevent it is by ennobling our souls, making ourselves beautiful souls. And this is something which is extremely attractive in my view.
Yeah, and I would quickly just make a note before you take over, Dave, that yeah, you don't have to have a religious doctrine, I think, to follow the golden rule, right? Of like, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, is one of the core teachings of Christianity. And that is most certainly, I think, a positive thing that, other cultures who might not have been Christian in their orientation have also clearly shown themselves to have taken on in their best moments of civilization and culture, and to care about the future children and unborn children is also, I think, a very good standard of morality. And we can definitely have a kind of sharing, a harmonious, relationship with others who share in that disposition.
Right. And yeah, again, Schiller, it's such a vast world. We've all read the Letters on Aesthetic Education of Man. which is where a lot of these ideas are elaborated in great detail. I recommend it to everyone. And yeah, well, I think for me, often it becomes a question of whether things are seen in a purely tribal way, right? You could be any religion you want. If you're coming at it from a truly tribal perspective, then yeah, you don't really necessarily care about all the children in the world or whatnot. You're concerned about your community, and your world pretty much stops there. And hey, that's not.
Right. You look at the Protestant versus Catholic wars, so it was Christian against Christian as well, right? Which you made a good point actually in one of our conversations when we were just hanging out, Dave, in terms of this idea of like you can't trust a country that isn't Christian. And it's like Europe had like the 100 Years War. There's like a war that's called the 100 Years War that was like Christians being pitted against Christians. So,
Well, there's more
there's
than.
something further, right? There's something further that we need to look into in terms of like how we're going to live in a world of harmony and common understanding and for the common welfare sort of thing.
As one of the Beatitudes says from Christ's Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So there's a lot of people that, and Schiller deals with this. So I don't think it's off topic, right? He deals with these questions of faith, spirituality, and man's ability to wrestle with, ultimately, when we're talking about religion, theology, we're dealing with questions of absolute truth, right? Absolute goodness, absolute beauty, absolute reason, and how man deals with these questions. And so for Schiller, he's saying, unless you have a conception of the beautiful, you're going to encounter all sorts of contradictions and paradoxes that you won't be able to resolve if you're just going at this from a purely tribal us versus them, right? And that historically we can see, what was more lethal to Christianity than these religious wars, right? The ones amongst themselves, the 100 Years Wars, the 200 Years War. There are many different wars. So yeah, and people can talk about foreign wars, but how often has it been the sort of the civil wars or the regional wars that have broken up the. Oh, okay. Well, Cynthia's going to be back. Her battery ran out. But yeah, so I think Schiller is saying that unless we have a conception of beauty, you're not going to be able to cultivate that universal taste, if you will, or aesthetic for seeing the humanity in something in the multiplicity, right? In something that seems a grouping that seems very different from yours, and how you resolve that multiplicity. And that's a very superficial level, right? Because people say, well, there are clear differences, and there are. But again, how do you deal with those differences in art? You alluded, Uwe, to, if we look at Chinese classical culture, I mean, you're going to find a lot of similar principles that are actually going to, I think, help even, Ezra Pound was very big. A lot of Western writers historically have drawn on the classics of the East to develop their own perspectives or enrich their own perspectives. So even there's always a win-win. We'll keep it moving here. I have another quote which can just build on what we were discussing. And, on your example, Uwe, of the baby, of the child, which Schiller also, he has a great epigram, which I'm not going to remember verbatim here, but basically the child is infinite potential, is boundless potential, in the sense that the conditions, man has this boundless potential, which is then ultimately limited by every defined condition in which he acts, but it's still boundless. And so the question becomes, under what conditions can this potential be cultivated? And that's where he's saying that beauty is the crucial factor in deciding how this potential is developed. So here in the 21st letter on the aesthetic education of man, he says, As soon as we remember that freedom is taken from man by the one-sided compulsion of nature and feeling, and by the exclusive legislation of the reason and thinking, we must consider the capacity restored to him by the aesthetical disposition as the highest of all gifts, as the gift of humanity. I admit that in his potential, he possesses this capacity for humanity already, before every definite determination in which he may be placed. But indeed, he loses it with every determined condition into which he may come. And if he is to pass over to an opposite condition, humanity must be in every case restored to him by the aesthetic life. It is therefore not only a poetical license, but also philosophically correct when beauty is named our second creatoress. For even though she only makes it possible for us to attain and realize humanity, leaving this to our free will, she thus has this in common with our original creatoress, nature, which has imparted to us nothing further than the potential for humanity, but leaves to our own determination of will the degree to which we make use of it. 21st letter on the aesthetic education of man. So here, as a metaphysical truth, Schiller is recognizing there's this objective potential in man, but then how do you objectively develop that depends on subjective conditions. And so how do you foster that? Well, again, as we said before, Schiller writes, as the mind in the intuition of the beautiful finds itself in a happy medium between law, the rational solution, and necessity, the action taken in survival mode, it is, because it divides itself between both, emancipated from the pressure of both. So yeah, in beauty, this duality between freedom and necessity is resolved. They coincide. And one of my favorite quotes from Schiller, which captures this, he writes, but in a beautiful life, as in a painting by Titian, all of those cutting border lines have vanished, and yet the whole form issues forth the more true, vital, and harmonious. That's on grace and dignity. All those cutting border lines have vanished in a beautiful painting, as in a beautiful life. So yeah, I think that's very profound and useful, that beauty has this power to remind and restore, right, Uwe, at the beginning in your article and what we touched on, listening to a classical composition helped you to regain your composure. And yeah, it seems very paradoxical until we get into how beauty actually works on man. One of the lines I've had bouncing around in my head is that the savageness of man can never be, without beauty, the savageness of man can never be tamed. But with beauty, all of a sudden you have a potential to correct all sorts of things, right?
I mean, basically, what we're talking about is happiness, isn't it? Which is a very, very interesting term. It's a very interesting concept, which of course was critical for the project to build a republic, a true republic, because a republic, if it is a true republic, is dedicated to making sure the conditions for the happiness of its citizens. And happiness in this way has to be understood as not just fun or party or whatever and easygoing, but happiness is, in my view at least, and I think Schiller saw it the same, like Gottfried Leibniz indeed always saw it to be the quest to fulfill your potential in a devout, humble way as a contribution to life, to the continuation, to the eternity of life.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a big question, right? Is happiness, what is happiness? And again, oh, is this too philosophical and abstract? Is happiness just acting on whatever immediate impulse one has, or just people say follow your heart. And I think Schiller would say, yes, follow your heart, assuming that you know how to develop, right, and cultivate the necessary faculties to do so, right? There's an intuitive power that man can't ignore if he's to be creative and if he's to be happy, if he's to act and live with ease, right? And freedom, even in difficult situations, right? To make sovereign decisions rather than just being a product of his time. But yeah, the freedom that we're talking about, the aesthetic freedom, presupposes man's capacity for development, and that there's no just freedom without development or cultivation, but that this cultivation and development is natural, right? It's what makes people happy when they feel that they're developing their potential. And I actually remember there's an interesting segment by Gabor Mate, who's a psychologist. He's the father of Aaron Mate, also a journalist. And he was saying that in his practice, what he saw is some of the most unhappy people were the people who had lived their lives and maybe they were successful, they had a lot of accomplishments and accolades, but the unhappiness stemmed from not being true to themselves, right? So I think of a lot of modern celebrities. They have power, fame, abundance, and they're beloved by all sorts of people. But who is it that the people love? Is it really the person who they are, or is it the image that has been curated? And to the degree that people have been just living out or playing out this image of themselves that isn't true to them, they're not happy. And so, yeah, we do need to find ways to develop our potential. And to the degree we feel we're not, we're usually unhappy, and we tend to disassociate, right? We tend to get distracted. So here again, beauty from the Schillerian standpoint brings clarity, right? It brings perspective. I'll read one quote and then let you guys respond, which you cite this in your essay on the future of humanity, Uwe. It's from Schiller's On the Sublime. All other things must. Man is the being who wills. For everything, the proverb says, there is a remedy, but not for death. But this single exception, if it actually is one in the strictest sense, would annul the whole notion of man. By no means can he be the being which wills, if there is even but a single case where he absolutely must what he does not will. His boasted freedom is absolutely nothing if he is bound even in a single point. Culture shall set man free and help him to fulfill his entire notion. It will make him capable, therefore, of asserting his will. For man is the being who wills. So even here now, Schiller's adding this dimension of will, right? He's qualifying this question of beauty with the question of will, which is interesting, right? What happens if you take will away? Do you really have beauty? Do you have aesthetic freedom if man isn't choosing? And arguably, at this level, going back to our opening theme about transhumanism, I think that would be on the highest aesthetic level. The refutation of transhumanism would be that it reduces man is basically the the whole is the sum of all parts. So man is just an aggregate of different chemicals, of different impulses, a bundle of perceptions, right? And what the transhumanist world comptroller believes he can do is optimize all the chemicals, all the forces, all the chemistry in man such that he is the highest performing or best possible combination of materials. But if we subscribe to that, if we subscribe to the idea that the whole is just the sum of its parts, that there's nothing beyond that, that the whole isn't more than the sum of its parts, then there is no free will, right? It's just a question of optimizing one's feelings, which is just derived from one's chemistry and biology. And to the degree that we can engineer human beings to make them more efficient, right? Whether socially, eugenically, or otherwise, the transhumanist argument is that you'll have the best possible world if you can just optimize human beings, which are grossly inefficient from the day to day, right? That's what they'd say. But one could argue from the Schillerian standpoint that that's a very ugly conception of man because it denies his free will. And so where is the beauty? The beauty just becomes a mathematical formula, right? How do you mathematically optimize people's chemistry? There's no freedom in that. And it's funny, we're in 2025, right? The debate over free will has been going on forever, and yet it's so popular today, right? The Sam Harrises of the world, the owners of meditation apps and stuff who preach the four horsemen of the Enlightenment, right? Is that not what they're called? They're the four horsemen of the the new
I think I'll add something to that quickly, Dave, and then I'm gonna probably have to step out because the person at this coffee shop is not very friendly to me having this meeting.
Okay.
But I think that that's a really good point that you're making on and what Uwe was making a point to at the beginning, which was like, what is freedom even, right? Because there are people who have different definitions of what is freedom. I would say like one of the most common definitions is that you should be able to do whatever you want as long as it's technically not, harmful to someone else. Although again, how we measure even harm is another thing that can be debated. And again, this is something that like had really come up during Plato's speeches as well. On the Gorgias, I think there's like a really good example, and Schiller most definitely also I think was a fan of Plato. But this idea of like, Plato was making the point of a vessel that was like full of holes, and someone who is just fulfilling physical desire, it's likened to you being obsessed with wanting to just fill a vessel that will have everything that you're filling. You go to like some stream to fill up this vessel, it will constantly slowly leak out, and everything that you're going about in terms of like the purpose to your life and everything is now about filling this vessel. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. And so when you think about it from that standpoint, is that really to be free? Because it sounds a little bit like you're chained to fulfilling desires that are ultimately fleeting. Versus, is there something that we can fill ourselves with that is much more stable, much more fulfilling, and can actually free us up to do things otherwise. And I think that sort of freedom is the freedom I'm most certainly happiest with, is a freedom that also has a sense of responsibility that comes with it. Because obviously, if we're living in a world where everyone's just living for themselves, it's not going to be a very great world that we're living in. Versus if we live for common beneficial tasks, which I think we're most happy with. People tend to, want a community. They seek out a healthy community. That's like very popular nowadays as well for people who want to reject, the transhumanist or overly technocratic or whatnot. They feel that there is something that's being lost about a kind of human dialogue. But the higher freedom is this idea of how you yourself can play a role in the benefit of others, but also being able to situate yourself not only in the present but in the future, in your future, to have a dialogue with your future self, to have a dialogue with the future possibilities of what lays before us in terms of possibilities. And that's what the greatest minds do. And that's why we continue to read them, because they were able to influence things that rippled throughout time. And I think that that's obviously a very powerful form of freedom, freedom in action, and to just live moment to moment, which is something that has been taught. It's a popular teaching, is actually really restricting from that standpoint, and ultimately does not free you to higher tasks. Freedom should be that you should feel that you can accomplish great things. That should be part of an idea of freedom. It should be to just, live without hardship or live without being challenged. So I think, again, that Schiller offers such a beautiful concept of a form of empowerment that actually comes very easily to us when we have access to optimism through beauty, which is also, beauty in truth, beauty in ideas that we can shape ourselves. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a rant.
No, I think that's useful. And just there are different people often think of freedom as license, right? If we think of the more Benthamite or Enlightenment ideas on freedom, or romantic ideas on freedom, right? One is just sort of following your heart, following your immediate impulse, do as thou wilt. And the other Enlightenment idea is more of a rationalistic, logical one, where basically you're supposed to just follow a logical, deductive line of thinking, and whatever is concluded there is pretty much what the right thing is. And so you're supposed to just follow that rationalistic line of thinking, regardless of what your emotions or your heart says. So both are dangerous, right? Because one assumes that man is supposed to just do his duty no matter what. But we know that when man is faced with serious challenges or doubts, he'll tend to go with what's in his heart, right? So the question is, what's in people's hearts? Because even if you can rely on rationality 80% of the time, often it's those decisive moments where there needs to be a special kind of fortitude or insight or vision that will allow you to leap over the chasm before you. And you need some heart for that, right? There has to be the sufficient strength or vigor or vision in your heart that you can pursue if you're going to leap over these chasms. So that's also a question of freedom. Do you have the freedom to do that? Do you have the freedom to be in a dialogue with, as Cynthia said, your future self, the future of humanity? And does that impact what we're doing? And how does that impact the heart versus just following one's Kantian duty at any given moment and emotionally being quite very limited, right? Very stifled. So yeah, there are many different ideas of freedom, and
So,
freedom.
so, so let me, because I'm almost bursting to get it out. And we've been now talking about freedom and about the heart, but we haven't mentioned yet love, which is something which is extremely important for Schiller. If you look at his Maid of Orleans, which is all about the capacity to love your neighbor, love your fellow countrymen, love your people, love your nation, even as you would love yourself. So it's not do as thou willst, but it is love your neighbor as yourself, which is um, driving and carrying Joan of Arc in Schiller's view, because he defends her against Voltaire's um, um, cynical, violent satire, which isn't a satire, it is really to try to destroy this idea of love as a foundation for a nation. Um, and this is something which is extremely important for Schiller in terms of it being something which, like beauty, reconciles two natures. It reconciles reason with uh, the um, with the natural survival mode egotism, and therefore this form of love, which Joan of Arc personifies in this play, which is one of the most important plays which Schiller wrote and thought about a lot, is something which plays into a definition of freedom in a comprehensive way, I would say.
Oh, you're muted. That was a really beautiful point, Uwe, and I'm really sorry, guys, that I have to drop off earlier than expected. But next time I will have a battery charger that will allow for a longer discussion. We should definitely do this again because, like you said, you can. There's no limit to how much we could talk about with Schiller. Maybe even talk about a few key pieces and maybe talk about those more in detail.
Yes, and we could keep going for a while, but yeah, here we can end it here. And what I'm going to do, and this is magic of television.